Welcome back to KIN 390. This is Lecture 6, Energy Use During Exercise. I'm still with you. This is Dr. Leininger, and we are still rolling along with Unit 2. In the first set of lecture slides, Lecture 5, I think we thoroughly discussed how to resynthesize ATP in terms of the pathways used and the reactions that are leading to the resynthesis of ATP. And I did start to mention at several points about when those pathways would be used. So this set of lecture slides is going to really solidify that for you, I hope. So this is all about energy expenditure and fatigue. So essentially what we're going to talk about is now you're moving. So as before, we were definitely talking about those metabolic pathways, and I hope you understand they're always running, and all of them do run all the time. Just sometimes one of them will predominate, and that's really what we're going to start to talk about today. We're going to start to move. We're going to start to do specific activities, and what happens then is that our energy transfer is going to start to increase. So for example, energy transfer increases about 4 times from sitting to just slow walking, strolling around. Then energy transfer will actually, if you go from walking to an all-out sprint, energy transfer is going to actually increase by about 120 times. So what I mean by energy transfer, if you want to think of it this way, is the resynthesis of ATP. You need more of that because you're going to be moving faster and or longer. And so that is going to definitely increase energy transfer. Okay, so actually I'm going to tell you what's going on right now. I have got a golden retriever laying across my lap. And so if you start hearing noises and stuff, it's Trooper. I should show you this, but I'm kind of trapped. So anyways, we're going to make do with what I'm doing here, which is cuddling a golden retriever and talking about energy transfer. 2 of my favorite things. So anyways, the 2 rules to energy systems. I told you in Lecture 5 that the first rule, and I just said it, is that all energy systems overlap. So all of them are contributing to the resynthesis of ATP, except, one may not be contributing very much, but essentially there's no on-off switches. The second rule is that energy systems or energy pathways are time and intensity dependent. So what that means is that even though they're running all the time, or they're all contributing somewhat to the creation of ATP, one is probably going to predominate. One's going to be the big driver, if you will. So what's the relative contribution of each of these energy systems for the performance of physical activities? Well, it first depends on the intensity of the exercise. So that's, if you want to think of it as most important. You have to know these 2 bits of information to know which one's predominating, but you absolutely have to know the exercise intensity. Second, duration or time. And that's why I call my second rule of energy systems time and intensity dependent. So you have to know, what does that mean? You need to, if you're looking at a physical activity, an exercise, an event, whatever, when you're looking at one of these things happening, you have to be able to determine how intense it is, and then you have to know how long someone does it for. It's these 2 bits of information that are going to lead you to know or to be able to estimate very well which energy pathway is contributing the most or predominating. So let's start on with ATP itself. So if you're doing maximal exercise of 1 to 3 seconds, we've talked about this already, so I'm hoping it's starting to sound familiar, and now I'm really hoping that everything's starting to come together. Remember, you do have a few, a little bit, if you will, of ATP stored in muscle cells. It's a heavy molecule, and remember that's why we don't store very much, and it's very limited. You have about 3 ounces. So for most individuals, that's only enough for a few seconds of all-out exercise. And then, of course, we must resynthesize it using whichever means possible. So this is maximal exercise of 1 to 3 seconds. So think about that here for a second. Oops, sorry, let me go back. Think about that here for a second. What activities take place that last 1 to 3 seconds and are an all-out maximal effort? I used the example in lecture 5 of a shot put. So what's the purpose of a shot put competition? Is to get that heavy ball, that heavy put, or shot, sorry, as far as you can down the field. So of course, that's going to be maximal. So a shot put is a great example of that. And really any of the throwing events. So like javelin, same thing. Or hammer throw, that's a crazy event. Or discus. These are all maximal exercises because the purpose of the event is to get that item as far as possible down the field, if you will. So 1 to 3 seconds. But also portions of events can rely on just ATP as well. So like a vertical jump, one powerful vertical jump, a jump ball, something like that, or a penalty kick in soccer. Very explosive, maximal exercise lasting 1 to 3 seconds. So it doesn't have to be just one type of event. Oftentimes in team sports, you'll see that that the stored ATP is going to be used for portions of that. And team events are good for that because, like soccer, you're going to notice that there's elements of that game that all of these pathways will be used at some point. Moving along then, let's go to that phosphagen system. So if you remember, you have that phosphagen system that has creatine phosphate. You have a little bit more of it stored in the sarcoplasm. These are, of course, anaerobic events, right? Because they don't require oxygen to do these pathways. If you're doing maximal exercise of about 3 to 15 seconds, you're absolutely going to rely mostly on the phosphagen system. So I use the example of the 100-meter sprint in lecture 5. But for those of you swimmers, a 25-meter sprint swim, so sprinting. This has to be sprinting. One set of 10 reps in the bench press if it's very heavy. That would be the phosphagen system. So this compound is going to supply energy for the first few seconds of all-out activity and those sprints at the end of a long race, for example. And don't forget, we're talking about creatine phosphate here, but it buys you a little bit more time. So if you sprint, let's go back to the soccer example. If you break away and you sprint for 15 seconds and then you slow down again, you're going to shift and start to use the phosphagen system predominantly, and then you'll shift back. So this is a very fluid situation as well. There's no, remember, on-off switches, but what starts to happen is that one may predominate over another at certain times. Moving on then, so let's say we're going to do real intense activity now for 30 seconds, 45 seconds, up to 3 minutes. Then we're going to be doing anaerobic glycolysis. So anaerobic glycolysis, remember what happens here is you have those first 10 steps of glycolysis occurring in the sarcoplasm, and we end with pyruvate. But if you're doing maximal exercise for 1 to 3 minutes, then what's going to happen is that pyruvate is going to go to lactate, right? So this would supply energy for like a 100-yard swim, a 400-meter sprint. So the world record for the 400-meter sprint is 43-ish seconds, I believe. No. Don't hold me to that. I'll look that up in a second. And then most of an 800-meter run, because most of the time an 800-meter run, especially if you're pretty quick, is about 2 minutes. For me, it'd probably be closer to 4, but that's beside the point. Where are you getting that fuel then? Where are you starting from? Stored intramuscular glycogen. You have to have it quickly, so you've got to be able to get it from somewhere close. And remember, if you're going to do something really intense very, very quickly, then you're going to have to use carbohydrate, right? So you're going to grab it from intramuscular glycogen. So let's stop here, or I shouldn't say stop. Let's go deeper then here and talk about lactate. Because lactate is actually being formed all the time, even at rest. And if I took a little blood sample from you right now to measure how much lactate was in your blood, it would actually be about 1 millimole. As you start to move more and more and more intensely, that will rise, because as you're doing really intense exercise, that pyruvate is going to become lactate, because we've got to resynthesize ATP quickly. We've got to use glycolysis to do it. And so you're going to get more and more lactate as the intensity occurs or increases. So lactate, it will cause some feelings of discomfort, some sensations of discomfort. And if you don't know what that is, I joked about this in lecture 5, but go out and sprint for about a quarter mile, right? Like 1 lap at a track. And I think you will understand what that feels like. So obviously in our day-to-day lives, we're not feeling that way. I hope not, at least. So you're not really feeling the burn if you're sitting around. And that's because you don't have that much lactate in your blood. It's about 1 millimole, as I mentioned, and that's not very much. What's happening is as you're making it, you're actually clearing it down at rest to about 1 millimole. But what happens as you exercise more and more intensely, you've got to use this system, so you're going to produce a lot of lactate. Okay. So I pretty much said most of these things already. So what I'm going to do here is go to the next slide. And lactate is a reason for fatigue. Okay, and fatigue simply means, I shouldn't say simply, it's pretty complex, but fatigue, the definition is the inability to maintain force output. I'll say it one more time. So fatigue is the inability to maintain force output. So if you are fatiguing in physical activity events, that means you're having to slow down or stop. So lactate is one of the reasons that you fatigues, because if you get too much lactate, then you're actually going to have to slow down and stop, because lactate, it actually cripples metabolism and it inhibits muscle contraction. So it's not that you don't want to continue sprinting. It's that there are several potential mechanisms for fatigue, and lactate is one of them. And lactate is what we would consider a metabolic cause of fatigue. But there's lots of other reasons that you fatigue, including neurological, psychological, and so on and so forth. And we'll talk more about that later. But for now, we're going to focus on lactate. And we're still within, again, this anaerobic glycolysis world. We're still talking about maximal exercise of short duration, okay, 30 seconds to 3 minutes or so. Even though this says about 1 minute, you probably do start to shift to this a little earlier than that. And that's okay, because there's no hard rules about time. These are all estimates. So as I mentioned, lactate is formed all the time and at all exercise intensity levels, but it doesn't accumulate at all exercise intensity levels. You actually do a pretty good job of clearing it down to that 1 millimole or about 1 millimole at rest by taking it places. So you're forming it all the time, and actually one of the reasons you're forming it all the time is red blood cells do not have mitochondria. So red blood cells only operate anaerobically. And so you're producing it, but then you're going to take it places. So you can take lactate, for instance, to the heart to be used for fuel. You can take it to the liver and actually create glucose from it. That is called the Cori cycle. So when you take lactate to the liver and it goes through the Cori cycle, you're going to create glucose from lactate. And that is called gluconeogenesis. When you create a new, I said this last lecture, lecture 5, when you create a glucose from a non-glucose substrate or starting from a non-glucose item, that is called gluconeogenesis. So you can do that in the liver. You can actually take lactate to adjacent muscle cells to be used, or it can accumulate. So at lower exercise intensity, like 50% of max or so, lactate's removed as quickly as it's formed. Because if you're moving at a really easy does it pace, the oxidative system is going to be your predominant energy system. So you're not producing as much, and so the systems for lactate removal can easily accommodate the smaller amounts that are being generated. But the more intense you exercise, lactate's going to be formed more rapidly, and the removal systems that I just mentioned can't keep pace, so it accumulates. So we have what happens here, and you may have heard of this, is that as exercise intensity increases, at some point in everybody, so there's going to be some intensity level for you, that lactate is formed faster than it can be removed. So the point in exercise, the exercise intensity at which lactate is formed faster than it can be removed is called lactate threshold. Lactate threshold. So check this picture out. So just showing you here, I'm not going to talk about the text yet, but what's showed here is that on the x-axis you have speed. So someone, let's say, is actually this would be a treadmill, and then the y-axis is lactate in millimoles, and as I mentioned, at rest it hovers around 1 millimole. And you'll see in this individual example that it stays really low at really low intensity. This is the amount of lactate in the blood. It stays really low because we're still able to clear it very, very quickly. However, in this individual, it looks at about a little over 4.2 meters per second. What starts to happen is those removal systems get overwhelmed because you're still moving very intensely. And so now we're accumulating lactate. And you can still exercise beyond lactate threshold, but you're just going to build more and more and more until you can no longer exercise. So you see that curve there, that how it's at here. Let's see, get this guy here. Resting levels, and then boom, there's going to be a big jump in the amount of lactate in the blood at a certain point in exercise. So this person here, in this example, like I said, about 4.2 meters per second, that would be their lactate threshold. So it's the point at which it begins to accumulate, right? There is one more direct measure of lactate accumulation called OBLA. And OBLA is always, onset of blood lactate accumulation is always 4 millimoles. So in this example, OBLA is here, right? Because OBLA is always 4. Now, personally, I much prefer the lactate threshold measurement because you can evaluate the data and get a much more accurate picture of where someone's lactate begins to accumulate. But some individuals also like to look at what pace do they hit 4 millimoles, right? And that's a little bit faster here than lactate threshold, but that is another measurement. But OBLA is always 4. In untrained individuals, the lactate threshold is going to occur at about 50 to 60% of maximal oxygen uptake. So same here, we've got exercise intensity increasing on the x-axis, and we have blood lactate on the y-axis. And you'll see here that for our trained individual, right? So our untrained individual has the markers here. So our untrained individual experiences lactate threshold in this example at a little less than 50% effort. And then our individual, for our trained subject, I would say they're not hitting lactate threshold till, a little bit beyond 60%. And then again, OBLA is always 4, so you can look and see where that happens as well. So in untrained individuals, what happens is because you haven't trained your systems to help clear the lactate, it's going to build up quicker than a trained individual. However, in trained individuals, and what we're talking about here is typically endurance trained individuals, the lactate threshold can occur at 70 to 80% of maximal oxygen uptake, or even more intensely. So that's a really good thing, because imagine if you can exercise at a higher relative intensity before the onset of lactate threshold, what can you do? You can go faster, right? So this person's not experiencing lactate threshold till much higher intensity. So if you have a higher lactate threshold, then you can exercise more intensely for longer. Because remember what happens when lactate builds up too much, you're going to have to slow down or stop. And so this is the point. This is the point of doing things like interval training. So if you've got a runner, for example, and they're trying to get faster at a, let's say, half marathon, you want that lactate threshold to go up. You want it, let me go back here. You want their lactate threshold to be further to the right, because that means they can exercise at a higher intensity for longer. Okay. Lactate threshold is actually one of the best indicators of performance. We're going to talk about VO2 max maybe in this lecture slides, we will in these lecture slides, but in this recording, but we'll get there. VO2 max is often thought of as kind of the hallmark of endurance trained individuals, meaning that if you have a really high VO2 max, you're going to be really good at endurance sport. And that is probably true. However, let's take the example, let's think of two cyclists, and they're endurance athletes, right? And you have these two cyclists that have the same VO2 max. Let's say it's 70 mils per kg per minute, which is really good. Whoever has the higher lactate threshold, all other circumstances aside, is going to win the race. Because if you have a higher lactate threshold, even if you have the same VO2 max, the person that has the higher lactate threshold exercises more intensely for longer. That means they can go faster for longer. So again, I'll repeat that lactate threshold is a really important marker for endurance athlete performance. Endurance athletes really want to have high lactate thresholds. So here we're talking about, we're still in the anaerobic glycolysis world, right? Now, let's talk about the oxidative system. So let's talk about intense exercise lasting 2 or 3 minutes plus, because this can go up to hours and hours and hours and hours. You can exercise very intensely for more than a couple of minutes. However, it wouldn't be considered an all-out maximal exercise. You are limited. Like I said, if you could sprint a marathon, we all would. But that is not metabolically possible. If you sprint after a couple of minutes, you're going to have to slow down and stop because of fatigue. But you can kick it down. You can kick the pace down a little bit. You can take it a little easier. And you can use the oxidative system. The oxidative system, remember, is great because you can get fuel from all of the macronutrients, and you have lots of fuel. Excuse me. So you have lots of fuel to use in the oxidative system. So oxidative system actually prolonged low-intensity physical activity, and you can actually do higher intensity activities, of course, like I said, over a couple of minutes. It just wouldn't be considered a sprint, for example. Okay, here's the rule. It's a mistake to conclude that the 3 energy systems switch on and switch off, and there's a blending. So there's, you've seen this one before. This is a very popular graphic for the contributions in maximal exercise. But I'm going to show you a few others because what this guy here shows you, and whichever graphic you like is great. I mean, I'm going to show you a bunch of different ones, but you can see here that in short duration tests of high intensity, 10 seconds, you can see that the percentage of the total work output, meaning where are you getting your energy from, is primarily creatine phosphate, ATP, and a little bit more glycolysis, but hardly any aerobic, but it doesn't switch off. By the time you're at intense exercise of 90 seconds, you are absolutely working with the glycolysis and the aerobic systems. And then here's another one that shows you kind of the duration of maximal exercise and then the percent anaerobic and the percent aerobic. But just remember, what's the take-home message? In the first 1 to 2 minutes of exercise, anaerobic systems are going to predominate during all-out effort, and then beyond 2 minutes, aerobic systems are going to predominate. So we're going to pick some activities here, and actually I'm going to show you videos once we complete this set of lecture slides. So what we're going to do is we're going to watch some videos, and then we're going to say which energy system predominates with those. Okay, so I'm going to come back to that. But this is one of those other graphics that's showing you a bunch of examples of events that are primarily anaerobic on this right side, and then primarily aerobic, right? So you can see that down here, how it kind of switches over. Okay, so when you're jogging, you've got 100% aerobic, 0% anaerobic, although we know that there's going to be some contribution to that, all the way up to 100% anaerobic for that 100-meter dash because you're staying in the phosphagen system, and then 0% aerobic. So it's just showing you all these different examples down this continuum, if you will. Okay, so actually I'm going to stop this video here because I'm going to now also post a video activity so that we can go back and do this. Okay, so hold tight and go ahead and click to the video activity right under this.